You know, sometimes the worst kind of poverty isn't about how much money you have in the bank. It's about how poor your own family makes you feel. And if anyone understood that kind of emotional bankruptcy, it was Sarah Hawthorne. The Hawthorne name meant old money, the kind of money that smelled faintly of polished mahogany and entitlement. Their wealth came from Hawthorne Industries, a company that manufactured specialized industrial equipment, dull, perhaps, but incredibly profitable for 3 generations. The family lived in Greenwich, Connecticut, in a sprawling estate that looked more like a museum than a home. But before we continue, don't forget to subscribe and like our channel. What city are you listening to this story from? Write to us in the comments. Now let's continue. Sarah, however, had always been the odd puzzle piece that didn't fit the picture frame. She wasn't interested in charity galas or country club politics. While her older brother, Richard, and her younger sister, Jennifer, had seamlessly slipped into their roles as heirs apparent, Richard running the company into the ground with misplaced confidence, and Jennifer mastering the art of high-end shopping, Sarah had gone another route entirely. She'd gone to business school, not to learn how to manage an inheritance, but to learn how to build something from scratch. This difference was a constant source of amusement for her siblings. The annual Thanksgiving dinner was usually the epicenter of the ridicule. The table was set with heirloom silver and crystal, but the atmosphere was thick with unspoken judgments. "So, Sarah," Richard drawled, leaning back in his chair, adjusting the cufflinks his wife, Cynthia, had bought him. Richard was a large man, physically imposing, with a laugh that sounded suspiciously like a foghorn. He was the CEO now, having taken over from their father, George, 3 years prior. Still playing with those little funds. Sarah, who looked sharp and focused even in a simple black dress, a stark contrast to Jennifer's glittering cocktail attire, took a sip of water. "It's called venture capital, Richard. And no, they're not little. We just closed a Series C for a tech startup in Austin last week. 75 million. Jennifer snorted, a delicate, practiced sound that usually followed any statement Sarah made involving numbers. Jennifer was blonde, impeccably manicured, and married to a hedge fund manager who inherited his money but liked to pretend he earned it. 75 million split among how many people, darling? Jennifer asked, waving a hand dismissively. It's just so volatile. You know, Richard was just saying yesterday how lucky we are that Hawthorne Industries is built on real assets. Things you can touch. Steel, inventory, real estate. Things that depreciate and become obsolete, Sarah murmured, more to her plate than to them. Excuse me. Richard frowned, his heavy brow furrowing. I said, it's great that the company is stable, Sarah corrected herself smoothly, avoiding a confrontation she knew was pointless. She had learned long ago that trying to educate Richard on modern supply chain economics was like trying to teach a cat calculus. But the truth was, stability was exactly what Hawthorne Industries lacked. Sarah knew it, because unlike her siblings, she actually read the quarterly reports the company was legally obligated to file, even if they weren't publicly traded. She saw the declining margins, the aging infrastructure, and Richard's stubborn refusal to pivot into new markets. Richard loved the idea of running a massive company, but hated the work star. He preferred the title, the private jet, and the power lunches to the grueling process of technological adaptation. Speaking of real assets, Richard continued, puffing out his chest, I'm thinking of finally taking the plunge and buying that yacht down in Miami. Cynthia needs a distraction from the foundation work, and frankly, I need a place to escape the office. The company needs a new ERP system, Richard, Sarah said, unable to stop herself. The entire table went silent. Even Cynthia, usually lost in her own thoughts about what color scheme to use for the next fundraiser, looked up. An ERP system. Jennifer giggled, covering her mouth with a napkin. Oh, Sarah, you sound like a textbook. What on earth is that? Enterprise resource planning, Sarah explained patiently, though her voice held a metallic edge. Your current system is 30 years old. It's vulnerable, inefficient, and requires too much manual input. It's actively costing the company money in wasted time and potential data breaches. Richard threw his head back and let out that booming, theatrical laugh, the one that always made Sarah feel like a silly child who had just asked a profoundly stupid question. Oh, Sarah, he chuckled, wiping a tear from his eye. You're so serious. Always looking for the bogeyman under the bed. We are Hawthorne Industries. We've been running just fine since Dad took over in the 80s. We don't need some Silicon Valley whiz kid telling us how to organize our spreadsheets. We have people for that. The people you have are overworked because the system is failing, Sarah pressed, ignoring the look of warning her mother, Eleanor, was shooting her from the head of the table. This was the core of their conflict. Sarah didn't just see the family company as a piggy bank. She saw it as a machine that needed maintenance. Richard saw it as an ATM. "Look," Richard said, dropping the jovial act and leaning forward, his voice taking on a patronizing tone. "I know you think you're a financial genius because you help 22-year-olds get funding for apps that deliver dog food, but this is real business. Big business. The kind of business that requires capital, resources, and trust. Things you left behind when you decided to be a freelancer." "I own Ethelred Capital, Richard. I'm not a freelancer." "Semantics," he waved off. "Tell you what, if you're so worried about the financial future of the company, why don't you put your own money where your mouth is? Buy some shares." Richard knew this was a cheap shot. When she left the family orbit after college, Sarah had refused the initial, small trust fund payout their father offered, preferring to earn her own way. She had built her VC firm from scratch, focusing on smart, aggressive investment, but the early years were lean, and most of her capital was tied up in her own funds and investments. She wasn't liquid in the way Richard or Jennifer were, who had inherited vast sums of easily accessible wealth. "Actually," Sarah said, her voice surprisingly steady, "I was going to ask about that." She paused, gathering her nerve. This was the moment she had rehearsed in her head for months. She knew the company was heading toward a crisis, and she had a plan, but she needed a foothold. A legal, undeniable stake. "I know the industrial division, Division 4, has been struggling for the last 6 quarters. The quarterly reports show the losses they are eating into the overall profit margin." Richard stiffened. He hated being shown up, especially with facts. "It's a temporary dip," he mumbled. "Market correction." "It's a failing product line," Sarah countered gently, "but it has potential if it's decoupled from the main operation and modernized. I want to buy Division 4. Or, at the very least, I want a controlling equity stake in that division, and I'll put my own team in to turn it around. We can use it as a testing ground for new technology." The silence this time was heavier, punctuated only by the clinking of Cynthia's ice. Richard stared at her, then looked at Jennifer, and then back at Sarah. He didn't just laugh this time, he roared. It was a genuine, gut-busting, tear-inducing fit of hilarity that shook the chandelier. Jennifer quickly joined in, a high-pitched, mocking sound. "Did you hear that?" Richard gasped, clutching his stomach. "She wants a piece of the company. A piece of Hawthorne Industries *. What are you going to pay us with, Sarah? Stock options from a company that sells virtual reality headsets to teenagers." "I have access to capital, Richard," Sarah stated, her face perfectly calm despite the heat rising in her chest. "I can fund the acquisition. I'm talking about restructuring a failing asset that is dragging down the value of the entire corporation." "Oh, please," Jennifer sneered, leaning across the table. "You probably want a 5% stake and think you're going to be on the board of directors. You're the black sheep, Sarah. You left. You chose your little hustle over the family legacy. You don't get to come back and play CEO when things get boring in your world." Richard finally caught his breath, wiping his eyes with his expensive linen napkin. "Let me be clear, Sarah," he said, his voice now dangerously soft, though still laced with mockery. "You are not getting a piece of this company. You are not buying a division. And you are not sitting on the board. This company belongs to the people who stayed, the people who understand what it means to be a Hawthorne. You tried to buy your way back in, and that is hilarious. Just focus on your little funds, okay? Leave the real business to the grown-ups." Sarah didn't argue. She didn't plead. She simply nodded slowly, her expression unreadable. She felt the sting of the rejection, not because she truly wanted to work with them. She didn't, they were impossible, but because she saw the disaster they were walking into, and they were too arrogant to accept a lifeline. "Understood," she said quietly. "I'll leave the real business to the grown-ups." She finished her wine and stood up, offering a polite excuse about having an early flight back to San Francisco. No one tried to stop her. No one ever did. As she drove away from the massive estate, she gripped the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles were white. The laughter of her siblings echoed in her ears. They laughed when I asked for a piece of the company. Fine. If they wouldn't let her buy a small piece to save them, she would just have to buy the whole damn puzzle. The next 18 months were a blur of intense activity for Sarah. Richard and Jennifer assumed she had retreated back to her frivolous tech world, licking her wounds. In reality, she was orchestrating the most significant deal of her career. Ethelred Capital had grown exponentially. Sarah's reputation in the investment world was stellar, built on a foundation of sharp analysis and ruthlessly effective execution. She didn't invest in flashy concepts. She invested in distressed assets and undervalued, legacy companies that had been crippled by poor management, companies exactly like Hawthorne Industries. She had spent months setting up a specialized acquisition vehicle within Ethelred, codenamed Project Chimera. Her target was Hawthorne Industries. The financial data confirmed everything she suspected. Richard's mismanagement had accelerated the company's decline. He had taken out massive, short-term loans to cover operating deficits and fund his lavish lifestyle, mortgaging key assets and inflating the company's perceived value. The debt covenants were tight, and a major payment was due in 6 months. If Richard missed it, the company would be technically insolvent, ripe for a hostile takeover or, worse, a fire sale. Sarah wasn't interested in a hostile takeover, not exactly. She wanted a clean purchase, driven by the bank's necessity, and she needed to move fast before another major private equity firm smelled the blood in the water. She brought in her CFO, Marcus Chen, a man whose calm demeanor masked a terrifying intelligence. "The numbers are atrocious, Sarah," Marcus said one chilly morning in their San Francisco office, sliding a thick binder across the glass table. "Richard is either criminally incompetent or actively trying to sink the ship for the insurance money. He just refinanced the Stanford plant at 12% interest." "He's incompetent," Sarah sighed, rubbing her temples. "He sees the company as a birthright, not a business. He thinks the Hawthorne name will always be enough. It won't be. Not when the covenants trigger. We need to have the full financing package ready to go in 4 months, maximum. The moment the bank realizes Richard can't make the interest payment, they'll be looking for a buyer who can step in immediately and guarantee stability." "That buyer will be us," Sarah confirmed. "We need to structure the deal to be undeniably attractive to the creditors. We save the jobs, we stabilize the community, and we guarantee the debt repayment. But we must insist on 100% control immediately. No minority shareholders, no board seats for the existing family." Marcus smiled, a rare, thin expression. "You really want to wipe the slate clean, don't you?" "They laughed at me, Marcus," Sarah said simply. "They laughed when I offered to save a small piece of the company. Now, they don't get a choice. I won't just be buying the company, I'll be buying the right to restructure their entire legacy." While Sarah was meticulously lining up capital from sovereign wealth funds and institutional investors, deals worth hundreds of millions, life continued as usual back in Connecticut. The siblings remained blissfully unaware of the impending catastrophe. Their father, George Hawthorne, had been in failing health for the past year. George was a complicated man. He loved his children, but he was traditional, and he had always favored Richard, seeing him as the natural successor. He had dismissed Sarah's financial career as too abstract. One Tuesday morning in late autumn, the call came. George Hawthorne passed away peacefully in his sleep. The passing was sad, but not unexpected. It triggered the final legal mechanism that Sarah had been anticipating, the reading of the family trust. The trust dictated how the remaining non-industrial assets, the sprawling Greenwich estate, the private art collection, personal investments, and the bulk of George's personal liquid wealth would be distributed among the 3 children. Crucially, the trust was separate from the ownership of Hawthorne Industries, which was handled through a complex web of corporate shares George had already transferred to Richard over the years. Richard, now officially the man in charge of everything, took immediate control of the funeral arrangements. He saw the funeral not just as a grieving process, but as a coronation. He was the CEO, the oldest son, the primary inheritor of the family name. The lawyer handling the estate, a stiff, ancient man named Mr. Peterson, scheduled the trust reading for the following Monday afternoon at 2 p.m. in his downtown Manhattan offices. Mr. Peterson called Richard first. "I need you to inform your sister, Jennifer, and your other sister, Sarah." Mr. Peterson's voice crackled over the phone. "It is imperative that all beneficiaries are present for the reading of the final stipulations." Richard leaned back in his leather chair, swirling the scotch he shouldn't be drinking at 10 a.m. He thought about Sarah. He thought about her insolence, her constant criticism of his management, and that humiliating Thanksgiving dinner when she tried to buy a piece of his company. A nasty idea formed in his mind, sharp and satisfying. "Yes, Mr. Peterson, I'll handle the notifications," Richard said smoothly. "But look, Sarah is difficult. She's out on the West Coast, always traveling. She probably wouldn't make it for a Monday afternoon meeting anyway. She barely cared about Dad in the end. Nonetheless, Richard, the will requires her presence." Right. Tell you what, I'll email her. But knowing Sarah, she'll probably ignore it. She's already told me she doesn't care about the estate's personal assets, just the company. I'll make sure she gets the message, though." Richard hung up the phone and smiled. He had no intention of emailing Sarah or calling her. He called Jennifer instead. "Jen, Dad's lawyer is scheduling the reading for Monday at 2. Manhattan office. Don't be late." Finally, Jennifer sighed dramatically. "I'm already eyeing the emerald necklace Mom always wore. Did you tell Sarah?" "Yeah, I told her." Richard lied easily. "She said she's got some big meeting in San Francisco. Probably can't make it. You know Sarah. Always too busy with her fake money to worry about the real stuff. But honestly, it's better this way. We don't need her attitude muddying the waters." Jennifer readily agreed. Sarah's absence meant less competition for the good pieces of art and jewelry. Richard felt a deep, childish satisfaction. Sarah had rejected their world, and now he was rejecting her. She wouldn't be present when the family legacy was formally distributed. It was a petty, symbolic punishment, but it was enough to make him feel completely in control. 2,000 miles away, in the gleaming Ethelred Capital headquarters, Sarah was not thinking about emerald necklaces or family trusts. She was staring at a massive, multi-screen display showing the complex financial structure of Hawthorne Industries, overlaid with projected bankruptcy curves. She was 10 days away from the final commitment deadline for Project Chimera. She was about to sign the papers that would commit Ethelred Capital to an acquisition bid that would shake the entire industrial sector. Her phone buzzed, showing a notification from her executive assistant, Claire. "Sarah, I just got a vague voicemail from an old-school lawyer in New York, a Mr. Peterson. He mentioned a mandatory meeting regarding the estate of George Hawthorne. He left a very confusing date, Wednesday the 10th at 2 p.m. Is this important?" Sarah glanced at the date on her calendar. Today was the 5th. The 10th. Sarah frowned. That seemed odd. The reading usually happened immediately after the funeral. She checked the funeral date in her notes. Richard had scheduled the private burial service for Sunday. "Claire, double-check that date." "That sounds like something Richard would mess up intentionally," Sarah said, her intuition immediately spiking. Claire called back 5 minutes later. "Okay, I called the lawyer's office again. I spoke to his paralegal. The actual reading is scheduled for Monday the 8th at 2 p.m. Mr. Peterson said he was sure he had informed Richard, and that Richard was responsible for notifying the beneficiaries." Sarah closed her eyes briefly, a flicker of cold rage passing through her. Monday. Richard had deliberately given her the wrong date, or simply withheld the information altogether, to ensure she would miss the reading. He wanted her excluded. He wanted to make a statement that she was no longer a true member of the Hawthorne inner circle. "Thank you, Claire," Sarah said, her voice dangerously calm. "Don't worry about it. I won't be able to make it on Monday anyway. I have a rather critical signing scheduled for that afternoon." And she did. Monday afternoon was the final, non-negotiable deadline for Ethelred to sign the commitment to the institutional investors funding the acquisition of Hawthorne Industries. It was a meeting she absolutely could not miss for the sake of an emerald necklace. Let them read their trust, Sarah thought, staring at the financial projections that showed the true, miserable state of Hawthorne Industries. They want to exclude me from the inheritance? Fine. I'm about to claim something much, much bigger. Monday morning dawned bright and cold in Manhattan. At 1:30 p.m., Richard and Jennifer, impeccably dressed in morning black, arrived at Mr. Peterson's opulent, wood-paneled office. They were accompanied by their respective spouses, Cynthia and Michael. They exchanged polite, solemn nods, though the air between them was thick with anticipation. This wasn't about grieving. It was about dividing the spoils. Where is Sarah? Mr. Peterson asked, looking over his half-moon glasses. Richard shrugged, adjusting his tie. As I told you, Mr. Peterson, she's busy. She's always busy. Too important for family matters, apparently. She said she wouldn't be able to fly in for a simple reading. Jennifer chimed in sweetly. Yes, she's quite dedicated to her alternative finance ventures. She's probably happier dealing with tech bros than legacy trusts. Mr. Peterson looked uncomfortable, but the will did allow the reading to proceed if a beneficiary was notified and willingly absent. Very well, the lawyer said, opening the heavy leather binder. We shall proceed. The reading itself was tedious, full of legal jargon and specific bequests. Jennifer got the art collection and a significant portion of the liquid assets. Richard received the Greenwich estate, the private planes, and the majority of the remaining cash. Their mother, Eleanor, was well provided for separately. As expected, Sarah was left a modest, equal share of the liquid assets, but nothing specific. No art, no real estate, nothing that indicated deep personal favor from the father. It was the share given to the child who had deliberately distanced herself. Richard and Jennifer exchanged triumphant glances. This confirmed it. Sarah was the outsider. So, that's it then? Jennifer asked, already mentally rearranging the paintings in her penthouse. Not quite, Mr. Peterson said. There is one final item. A codicil, drafted 6 months prior to Mr. Hawthorne's passing. Richard frowned. A codicil. Dad never mentioned a codicil. It pertains to the future of Hawthorne Industries, Mr. Peterson announced, clearing his throat. It states that while Mr. Richard Hawthorne retains his current majority share ownership, should the company require restructuring or acquisition within 2 years of his passing, there is a specific provision regarding the family's involvement. Richard scoffed. Acquisition. That's absurd. The company is fine. Dad was just being overly cautious. Mr. Peterson ignored him and read the final paragraph, his voice slow and deliberate. Should Hawthorne Industries enter into a binding agreement for acquisition by a venture capital firm or institutional investor, any remaining shares held by the family shall be subject to a right of first refusal, granted exclusively to the founder or majority owner of the acquiring entity, should that person be a direct descendant of George Hawthorne. Jennifer looked confused. What does that even mean? We are not selling the company. Richard, however, looked pale. He understood the implication. His father, worried about Richard's recklessness, had created a backdoor mechanism. If the company did fail and had to be sold, George wanted to ensure that if one of his children was involved in the rescue, they would get priority access to the remaining family shares. It was a safety net. It means if the company is sold, and if Sarah is somehow involved in buying it, Richard spat out the name like a curse, then she gets first crack at buying up any shares we still hold, effectively cutting us out of the residual value of the sale. But she's not involved. Jennifer insisted. Of course she's not, Richard said, though he didn't sound entirely convinced. She's too busy with her dog food delivery apps. This is just Dad being sentimental about her business degree. Mr. Peterson put the documents down. Well, that concludes the reading. I wish you all peace during this difficult time. Richard and Jennifer left the office, feeling a mix of relief and lingering suspicion about the codicil. They had received their inheritance, and Sarah had been successfully excluded from the pomp and circumstance. Richard had won the short game. Meanwhile, on the West Coast, Sarah and Marcus were shaking hands with 3 representatives from the largest institutional lender in the world. The room was tense, the stakes astronomical. The terms are aggressive, Ms. Hawthorne, the lead representative, a stern woman named Ms. Davies, stated, reviewing the final commitment documents for Project Chimera. You are effectively guaranteeing the debt of a company that is currently on life support. Your personal and corporate reputation is entirely tied up in this restructuring. I'm aware, Ms. Davies, Sarah replied, her voice steady. But I know this company better than anyone. Hawthorne Industries has solid bones, just poor leadership. We will replace the management structure entirely, modernize the plants, and pivot the product lines within 18 months. The return on investment will be substantial. And the acquisition timeline. We move immediately. Richard Hawthorne has a major interest payment due in 3 weeks. He cannot make it. Our sources confirm he has exhausted his credit lines. The moment he defaults, We step in with a pre-packaged acquisition plan that satisfies the creditors, guarantees the company's survival, and ensures a clean break from the old regime. Ms. Davies nodded, impressed by Sarah's confidence and the sheer detail of her plan. Ethelred Capital had already secured the backing of the major creditors. The deal was essentially a foregone conclusion. They were just waiting for Richard to trip over his own debt. Sarah signed the massive stack of papers. The ink was barely dry when Marcus handed her an urgent internal memo. "Sarah, this just came in. It's a leak from the Hawthorne Industries accounting department. Richard just tried to cash out a major asset, the property the Division 4 plant sits on, to make the interest payment. The bank froze the transaction. He's officially in technical default." Sarah looked at the date on the memo. Monday, 4 p.m. Eastern Time. "It's time," Sarah said, a cold, fierce joy settling in her stomach. "Initiate the acquisition protocol. Notify the creditors that Ethelred Capital is invoking the pre-negotiated terms. And Marcus, call Mr. Peterson, the family lawyer. Tell him I need him to schedule a very important, immediate meeting with Richard and Jennifer for Wednesday morning." "What about the acquisition announcement?" Marcus asked. "Hold the public press release until after the meeting," Sarah instructed, a slow smile spreading across her face. "I want to deliver the news personally. Richard and Jennifer need to hear it from the black sheep." Richard and Jennifer were having a celebratory dinner that Monday evening. The trust reading was complete, the estate divided, and Sarah had been successfully excluded. Richard felt a sense of vindication he hadn't experienced in years. Honestly, the nerve of her, trying to buy Division 4, Jennifer scoffed, sipping champagne. Like she could ever run something real. "She's irrelevant now," Richard declared, raising his glass. "The company is mine, the estate is mine, and Sarah is stuck playing with her digital dollars. Cheers to the real legacy." They clinked glasses, drowning out the nagging fear in Richard's gut about the frozen asset sale. He was behind the curve on the interest payment, but he was sure he could wrangle an extension. He always did. The next morning, Richard received a curt phone call from Mr. Peterson. "Richard, I need you and Jennifer to come back into my office immediately. Wednesday morning, 9 a.m. sharp. I have received an extremely urgent, time-sensitive communication regarding Hawthorne Industries." "Urgent? What is it? Is it about the company's debt? I'm negotiating an extension now." "It is not about your negotiations, Richard. It is about an acquisition. And the person who signed the commitment papers for the acquiring firm is requesting an immediate audience with the family." Richard felt a sudden, icy weight in his stomach. Acquisition? That was impossible. He hadn't seen any bids. Who would buy a company that was struggling this badly, unless they were planning a massive liquidation? "Who is it, Mr. Peterson?" Richard demanded. The lawyer hesitated, sounding genuinely uneasy. "The firm is Ethelred Capital, and the majority owner and signatory is Sarah Hawthorne." The name hit Richard like a physical blow. He dropped the phone slightly, catching it just before it hit his desk. "Sarah," he whispered. "That's insane. She runs a boutique VC firm. She doesn't have the capital for this." "Richard, I have seen the legally binding acquisition papers signed this afternoon. Ethelred Capital is backed by a consortium of major institutional lenders. They have guaranteed the debt repayment and are taking over 100% of the company, effective immediately, pending final board approval, which, given the insolvency, is a formality." Richard felt the blood drain from his face. All the arrogance, all the confidence, evaporated instantly. The yacht, the estate, the perceived power, all of it felt suddenly tenuous. "Tell them," Richard stammered, trying to regain control. "Tell them I refuse to meet. I'll fight this. I'll sue." "You can try, Richard." Mr. Peterson's voice was dry, devoid of sympathy. "But Ethelred Capital isn't just buying the company. They are buying the debt from the creditors, who were legally entitled to sell when you defaulted yesterday afternoon. They own the majority of your liabilities now. And Richard, Sarah is invoking the codicil. She wants to discuss the transfer of your remaining shares." Richard gripped the edge of his desk. They had laughed at her. They had excluded her from the trust reading. They had treated her like a joke. And all the while, she hadn't been playing with little funds. She had been preparing a financial nuclear strike. "Fine," Richard choked out, his voice hoarse with humiliation and rising panic. Set the meeting. Wednesday, 9 a.m. I want to see her face when I tell her she can't have it. But deep down, Richard knew. He had already lost. Sarah wasn't coming to beg for a piece of the company this time. She was coming to claim the whole thing. Wednesday morning in Manhattan. The air was crisp and unforgiving. Richard and Jennifer arrived at Mr. Peterson's office. Their demeanor entirely changed. Richard was pale, his suit looking rumpled. Jennifer had clearly been crying. Her makeup was heavy, and her eyes were red. They weren't there for a celebration. They were there for an execution. They sat across the large conference table, stiff and silent. Mr. Peterson sat at the head, looking like a weary referee. The door opened, and Sarah walked in. She wasn't wearing morning black. She was wearing a perfectly tailored charcoal grey suit, sharp and powerful, the kind of attire that screamed institutional finance. Her hair was pulled back, revealing a face that was calm, intelligent, and utterly devoid of emotion. She looked like a conqueror stepping onto conquered territory. Richard stared at her, unable to reconcile this woman, this financial titan, with the younger sister he had ridiculed for years. Richard. Jennifer, Sarah said, her voice low and professional, like a lawyer addressing the opposing counsel. She didn't offer a hug or even a handshake. She sat down directly across from them, placing a slender leather briefcase on the table. Sarah, what is the meaning of this? Richard demanded, his voice shaking. You can't do this. You can't just buy the family company out from under us. I didn't buy it out from under you, Richard, Sarah corrected, her tone flat. You drove it into the ground. I merely purchased the debt from the creditors when you defaulted on your obligations. Ethelred Capital is now the majority stakeholder and the controlling interest in Hawthorne Industries. Jennifer burst into tears. But what about the legacy? Our family name? You were supposed to save the company, not steal it. I am saving it, Jennifer, Sarah countered, meeting her sister's gaze without flinching. I am saving the employees, the plants, and the infrastructure. I am ensuring the company survives your brother's incompetence. And as for the legacy is now mine to define. Richard slammed his hand on the table. You are the black sheep. You left us. You don't deserve this. Sarah just looked at him, a flicker of genuine sadness crossing her features, quickly replaced by steel. Deserve, Richard? Deserve is getting what you earn. You earned this failure. I earned the capital to prevent it. She opened her briefcase, pulling out a single sheet of paper. I called this meeting for 2 reasons, Sarah continued. First, I want to deliver the news personally. Richard and Jennifer need to understand exactly what happened here. Second, Sarah paused, tapping the paper lightly. I am invoking the codicil in our father's trust. Richard, who had been struggling to compose himself, stiffened. The codicil? What does that even mean? That was some legal nonsense about future sales. We are not selling the company to you, Sarah. We are being hijacked. The acquisition is complete, Richard. The paperwork was signed Monday afternoon. You were in default. The creditors accepted Ethelred's bid, a bid that guaranteed their principal and interest, which you, incidentally, could not. Sarah's voice was utterly devoid of triumph. It was pure, cold fact. As for the codicil, it states that if the company is acquired by a venture capital firm run by a direct descendant, that person has the right of first refusal on all remaining family shares. Jennifer stopped crying, momentarily confused by the financial terminology. Remaining shares? Dad transferred everything to Richard years ago. Not everything, Jennifer, Sarah countered. He transferred the controlling interest, yes. But George Hawthorne retained a small, non-controlling block of shares, about 8%, that he held in trust for all 3 of us, equally. He wanted to ensure that even if Richard ran the main company, the heirs would still receive a small dividend stream from those shares in perpetuity. Richard's eyes widened, a dawning horror spreading across his face. The legacy trust shares, he never mentioned them. He didn't need to, Sarah said dryly. They were meant to be a silent, stable asset. But thanks to the codicil, which our father drafted 6 months ago, I have the exclusive right to purchase those shares from you, immediately. She slid the single sheet of paper across the table. It was a formal offer letter from Ethelred Capital. The price is based on the pre-acquisition valuation, which, given the company's insolvency and massive debt load, is low. You will receive a modest payout for your 2.6% share, Richard. And you will receive the same, Jennifer. But you will receive no ongoing residual income, no future dividends, and absolutely no claim on the restructured entity. Richard grabbed the paper, his hands trembling. He scanned the numbers, his breath catching in his throat. It was a fraction of what he had expected the shares to be worth, especially if the company was successfully turned around. "You are cutting us out of the future," he roared, throwing the paper back onto the table. "You cut yourselves out, Richard," Sarah stated. "You drove the company to the brink. This transaction is the legal cleanup. You lose the company, and you lose the remaining equity. That's the consequence of failure." Jennifer, finally piecing together the true depth of the disaster, looked at Richard with panicked accusation. "You said she was too busy. You said she couldn't make the trust reading. You deliberately left her out." The irony was brutal, a sharp twist of the knife. They had excluded Sarah from the distribution of a few $1,000,000 in personal wealth, only for her to use the legal mechanism hidden within that very trust to seize control of the billion-dollar company. Sarah watched the panic spread between them, letting the silence hang heavy. "Speaking of the trust reading," Sarah continued, leaning forward slightly, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial level, though still professional. "I noticed I was given the wrong date. Monday was the reading, but I was told Wednesday. I was deliberately misled." Richard swallowed hard, unable to meet her gaze. It was a mistake. An oversight. "No, Richard," Sarah said, shaking her head. "It was intentional. You wanted to cement my role as the outsider. You wanted to make sure the black sheep wasn't present when the real wealth was distributed. You wanted to humiliate me, just like you did at Thanksgiving when I asked for a piece of the company." She paused, her eyes flashing with the accumulated frustration of 2 decades of condescension. "But here's the thing about that Monday reading, Richard. While you and Jennifer were sitting here, dividing up Dad's old paintings and celebrating my absence, I was signing the final commitment papers for Project Chimera. I missed the distribution of the small fortune, so I could secure the acquisition of the entire company." She didn't gloat, but the statement hung in the air, heavier than any boast. It was the ultimate MIC drop. "You wanted to make me feel small," Sarah finished, gathering the papers back into her briefcase. "You failed. You didn't exclude me from the company. You simply paved the way for me to take it over cleanly, without having to deal with your interference on the board." Richard suddenly stood up, knocking his chair back. He was breathing heavily, his face mottled red. "I am the CEO. You can't just walk in here and take my company. I will fight this in court. I will tie you up in litigation for years." Sarah looked up at him, entirely unimpressed by his bluster. "You can try, Richard. But you don't have the resources. Ethelred Capital has secured the best legal counsel in the country, specializing in distressed asset acquisition. More importantly, the acquisition was triggered by your technical default, which you initiated yesterday afternoon when you tried to illegally sell the Stanford plant property to cover your operating expenses. That was a breach of contract with the creditors, and they are now fully aligned with Ethelred." She looked pointedly at Mr. Peterson. "Mr. Peterson, please confirm the termination terms." Mr. Peterson, clearly relieved to be speaking about legalities rather than family drama, picked up a document. "Effective immediately, Richard, your employment contract as CEO of Hawthorne Industries is terminated without cause, as per the acquisition terms. You are required to vacate the corporate offices in Stanford by 5 p.m. today and surrender all company assets, including the private jet, corporate credit cards, and company phones." Richard opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He was, professionally, instantly unemployed. Jennifer looked horrified. "But the salary, the bonuses, how will he pay for the Greenwich estate? The maintenance alone is astronomical." Sarah watched Jennifer's superficial concern, not for Richard, but for their shared lifestyle, with a sense of weary familiarity. "That, Jennifer, is Richard's problem," Sarah said coolly. "My concern is the immediate stabilization of Hawthorne Industries. Richard, I have already informed the COO, Mr. Davies, that he is taking over as interim CEO. He is a professional, and he understands the turnaround plan." Richard finally found his voice, a broken, desperate sound. "But my investment. I've put years into this company. My life is this company. Your life was spending the company's money, Richard, Sarah corrected him. And as for your investment, the acquisition price factored in the remaining shareholder equity, which you were being compensated for. You were being paid for your shares, Richard. You were just not being paid what you thought they were worth. She stood up, signaling the end of the meeting. She didn't need their consent. She just needed to deliver the news. Jennifer, your role in the company was non-existent, so there are no immediate changes to your life, other than the fact that your annual dividend checks from the legacy shares will cease. You will receive the buyout payment for those shares shortly. Jennifer looked up, her eyes wide with sudden fear. Wait, Sarah. Can't we talk about this? Can't we be partners? We are family. You always wanted to help the company. Sarah looked at her sister, the woman who had mocked her ambition and belittled her career for years. I wanted to help the company when it was possible to work asterisk with asterisk you. You refused that offer. You laughed at me. Sarah's voice was steady but carried a weight of finality. Now, I am helping the company despite you. There will be no partnerships. You are no longer involved in Hawthorne Industries in any capacity, financial or operational. That is the cost of your arrogance. She looked back at Richard, who was slumped in his chair, defeated. Richard, I have one final piece of advice, purely personal, Sarah said. When you leave the office today, don't try to use the corporate jet to fly to Miami. It's already been grounded. And perhaps hold off on buying that yacht you were eyeing. You'll need the liquidity. With that, Sarah turned to Mr. Peterson. Thank you for facilitating, Mr. Peterson. My team will handle all subsequent communication regarding the acquisition, restructuring, and the transfer of the legacy shares. She walked toward the door, her movement purposeful and swift. Just as her hand reached the brass handle, Richard spoke, his voice low and bitter. You always hated us, didn't you, Sarah? You always wanted to tear us down. Sarah paused, turning back to face her brother and sister, who looked like ghosts of their former entitled selves. No, Richard, she said quietly. I never hated you. I just hated how small you tried to make me. I hated that you thought the name and the money were enough. I spent 20 years proving I didn't need your approval or your inheritance. But when you actively tried to exclude me from the family legacy, you forced my hand. You wanted me to leave the real business to the grown-ups? Fine. I grew up. And I bought the whole damn thing. She opened the door and walked out, leaving them alone in the oppressive silence of the expensive Manhattan office. The following weeks were a whirlwind of media coverage and corporate chaos. The acquisition of Hawthorne Industries by Ethelred Capital was front-page news in the financial world. The analysts were stunned, not just by the size of the deal, but by the fact that the CEO of the acquiring firm was a direct heir who had been publicly estranged from the family business. The narrative was irresistible. The black sheep returns as the savior, or perhaps the executioner. Sarah, now officially the executive chairwoman of the newly restructured Hawthorne Industries, refused all personal interviews. She let the facts speak for themselves. Her team moved with ruthless efficiency. The old, failing ERP system she had warned Richard about was replaced within a month. Key personnel who had been stifled by Richard's mismanagement were promoted. The Stanford plant, which Richard had tried to sell, was instead earmarked for a multi-million-dollar modernization investment. Richard and Jennifer, meanwhile, were struggling to adapt to their dramatically changed circumstances. Richard's life crumbled almost instantly. Without the CEO salary, the lavish corporate expense accounts, and the implicit credit line of a major industrial company, his personal finances were revealed to be as flimsy as the company's balance sheet. He was forced to sell the private planes immediately. The Greenwich estate, while technically his from the trust, was mortgaged to the hilt, and without Richard's massive income, the bank quickly started applying pressure. He tried to sue Ethelred Capital, claiming the acquisition was predatory. His lawyers quickly informed him that the case was baseless. Sarah had followed the letter of the law precisely. Richard had defaulted. The creditors had sold. End of story. His only remaining play was the small payout from the legacy shares, which barely covered his outstanding property taxes. Jennifer, too, felt the sting of financial reality. Her husband, Michael, the hedge fund manager, was deeply embarrassed by the public failure of his brother-in-law. When Richard's financial situation became a liability, Michael suggested, with thinly veiled cruelty, that Jennifer should perhaps downsize her exorbitant spending habits. The loss of the Hawthorne Industries dividend stream while small in the grand scheme, was a psychological blow. It represented the end of guaranteed, effortless wealth. The siblings, once inseparable in their disdain for Sarah, now avoided each other, too ashamed and angry to commiserate. 6 months later, Sarah was back in Greenwich, Connecticut, but not at the family estate. She was attending the official ribbon-cutting ceremony for the renovated Stamford plant, now humming with new technology and efficient operations. The local mayor was there, the governor's representative, and hundreds of employees who had kept their jobs thanks to Sarah's intervention. The mood was one of cautious optimism and gratitude. As the press cameras flashed, Sarah stood on the podium, looking out at the crowd. She spoke not of profit margins, but of stability and community. Hawthorne Industries was built on a foundation of American ingenuity and hard work, she said, her voice amplified across the factory floor. For a time, we lost our way. We allowed complacency and poor management to erode that foundation. But Ethelred Capital didn't acquire this company to strip it for parts. We acquired it to rebuild it, smarter and stronger. She was the hero now, the one who had saved hundreds of jobs and restored faith in a legacy American manufacturer. After the ceremony, Sarah was walking through the administrative offices with Marcus Chen, her CFO, who had flown in for the event. The turnaround is ahead of schedule, Sarah, Marcus noted, reviewing a report on his tablet. The new ERP system has cut operating costs by 15% already. We are on track for profitability next quarter. Richard's mess is almost cleaned up. Almost, Sarah murmured, stopping in front of a window that overlooked the executive parking lot. Speaking of Richard, Marcus continued, looking up from his report, I hear he finally sold the Greenwich estate. Took a huge loss, but he managed to clear enough debt to avoid bankruptcy. He and Cynthia moved into a condo in Boca Raton. Sarah didn't react, staring out the window. He's still bitter, I imagine. Oh, incredibly. He tried to get a job at 3 different competitor firms, but his reputation is mud. Nobody wants the guy who drove Hawthorne Industries into the ground. Marcus paused. You really hammered him, Sarah. Professionally and financially. Sarah turned away from the window, leaning against the wall. I didn't hammer him, Marcus. I just stopped holding the ladder for him. He fell on his own. She felt no satisfaction in Richard's downfall, only a quiet, resolute sense of justice. She hadn't sought revenge, she had sought control and competence. The fact that Richard lost everything was merely a side effect of his own poor choices colliding with her financial capability. Later that week, Sarah was back in her San Francisco office, preparing for the next major initiative, the integration of new robotics technology into the production line, an investment Richard would have scoffed at. Her assistant, Claire, buzzed her intercom. Ms. Hawthorne, I have a call holding. It's a personal line, restricted number. The caller insists it's urgent and personal. It's Jennifer. Sarah hesitated. She hadn't spoken to Jennifer since that disastrous meeting in Mr. Peterson's office. Put her through, Claire, Sarah instructed. A moment later, Jennifer's voice, usually high and bright, sounded strained and small. Sarah, is that really you? Yes, Jennifer. What do you need? Sarah kept her tone strictly professional, bordering on indifferent. I just wanted to call and say, thank you, I guess. Sarah frowned. Thank me. For what, Jennifer? For the buyout money, Jennifer whispered. It wasn't much, but it came at a good time. Michael is having some liquidity issues at his firm. They're downsizing. And honestly, the stress of living like we were used to, knowing Richard was sinking the company, it was terrible. We sold the penthouse. We're moving somewhere smaller, quieter. This was astonishing. Jennifer, the queen of superficiality, admitting to downsizing? And why are you telling me this? Sarah asked. Because, Jennifer sighed, a genuine, tired sound. I realized you were right about everything. About Richard, about the company, about the need to actually work. I didn't see it then. I was so busy being comfortable, I let myself be blind. We all laughed at you, Sarah, because we were scared of the world you lived in. The real world where you actually have to earn things. Sarah listened, surprised by the honesty. It wasn't an apology, not exactly, but it was an acknowledgement of her own failure. I'm sorry we were awful to you, Sarah, Jennifer finally said, her voice cracking slightly. We were always so proud of the name, but you're the only one who actually did anything with it." Sarah leaned back in her chair, the hard edge around her heart softening slightly. She would never trust them, but hearing Jennifer admit the truth was a small victory, greater than any financial gain. "Jennifer, I appreciate you calling," Sarah said, "but I'm not running a charity. I acquired Hawthorne Industries because it was a sound business decision, and because I was tired of being dismissed. I hope you and Michael find stability." "We will," Jennifer replied, sounding more determined than Sarah had ever heard her. "I'm actually looking into going back to school. Maybe a certification in interior design. Something real." They exchanged a few more polite, awkward words, and then hung up. Sarah sat in silence for a moment, looking at the city lights twinkling outside her window. The noise of the past 6 months, the acquisition, the media storm, the family fallout, finally began to settle. She had achieved what she set out to do. She had saved the company, destroyed the narrative of the black sheep, and proven her genius to the people who mattered least. A year passed. Hawthorne Industries was thriving. Sarah had successfully integrated the new technologies and expanded into lucrative international markets. The company was now valued at 4 times what Ethelred Capital had paid for it. Sarah was, undeniably, one of the most powerful women in American industry. Richard, having failed to secure executive employment, had moved into consulting, scraping by on small, regional contracts. He was a shadow of his former self, his arrogance replaced by a quiet, simmering resentment. Jennifer, true to her word, had started her own small, successful interior design business in Florida, focused on high-end residential renovation. She and Sarah maintained a distant, but civil, relationship, a fragile peace built on mutual respect for their separate, hard-earned successes. The annual Thanksgiving dinner at the old Greenwich estate was, naturally, a thing of the past. Eleanor, their mother, had sold the large house and moved into a smaller, more manageable home in a nearby town, finally free of the burden of the massive, empty mansion. The second Thanksgiving since the acquisition, Sarah was hosting a small, intimate dinner at her own newly purchased, modern home overlooking the Pacific Ocean in Marin County. It was just Sarah, Marcus, Claire, and a few close friends, people who understood the value of earned success. As they raised their glasses, Marcus, ever the pragmatic one, smiled at Sarah. "To the most profitable acquisition of the decade," he toasted. "And to the best revenge." Sarah smiled, a genuine, relaxed smile that rarely appeared during her days as CEO. "It wasn't revenge, Marcus," she corrected him softly. "Revenge is emotional. This was simply a highly leveraged financial transaction that corrected a profound management failure. It just happened to also correct a historical injustice." She thought back to that final confrontation in Mr. Peterson's office, the look on Richard's face when he realized she wasn't asking for permission, but delivering a verdict. They laughed when I asked for a piece of the company. And her response had cost them everything. Sarah took a sip of wine, looking out at the glittering lights of the Bay Area. She had the company, the wealth, and the respect. But more importantly, she had the freedom that came from knowing she had built her own empire, brick by painstaking brick, and no one could ever take it away. She was the majority owner, the undisputed leader, and the financial genius they had always scoffed at. The story of Sarah Hawthorne, the black sheep, was finally complete. The legacy of Hawthorne Industries was safe, rebuilt, and entirely, unequivocally, hers. But the story wasn't quite over, was it? Because even when you think you've tied up all the loose ends, life, and family, has a way of surprising you. About 18 months after the acquisition, Sarah was preparing for the annual shareholder meeting. This was a critical event, the first time the new, public-facing Hawthorne Industries would present its stellar results to the market. Sarah was reviewing the final presentation slides when Claire buzzed her. "Ms. Hawthorne, I have a call from Mr. Peterson. He sounds rather urgent." Sarah frowned. She rarely dealt with the family lawyer anymore. All legal matters were handled by Ethelred's corporate team. "Put him through." Mr. Peterson's voice came through, sounding strained and formal. "Ms. Hawthorne, I apologize for the interruption, but I have received an extraordinary document that requires your immediate attention. It concerns your mother, Eleanor Hawthorne." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. "Is Mom all right?" "She is fine, physically," Mr. Peterson assured her. "But this pertains to the final distribution of the residual assets of the George Hawthorne Trust, specifically the non-industrial assets held in reserve by Eleanor." Sarah was confused. I thought that was all settled with the trust reading 2 years ago. It was, mostly. But there was a small, final provision, a safety net, that only triggered upon Eleanor's successful sale of the main Greenwich estate, which she completed 6 months ago. Sarah listened intently. What possible asset could be left that the lawyers hadn't found? Mr. Peterson, what is it? It is a portfolio, Ms. Hawthorne. A portfolio of private, non-voting shares in a very specific venture capital firm. Your father established this account 20 years ago, shortly after you graduated from business school, and funded it annually. Which firm? Sarah asked, a sudden cold premonition settling over her. Mr. Peterson cleared his throat. The firm is Ethelred Capital. And according to this final codicil, those shares, representing approximately 15% of the private equity in Ethelred Capital, are to be distributed equally among his 3 children upon the closure of the estate. Sarah froze. 15% of Ethelred Capital. Her company. Her highly valued, private, successful company. Wait, Sarah said slowly, trying to process the implications. My father owned 15% of Ethelred Capital? How? I never knew he invested. He invested through blind trusts and offshore funds, Ms. Hawthorne, Mr. Peterson explained. He wanted to support your venture, but he also wanted to maintain neutrality in the family conflict. He never wanted Richard or Jennifer to know he was financially backing your little funds. He intended for this to be a final, quiet distribution of wealth, a way to ensure all his children, including you, were substantially taken care of, regardless of the fate of Hawthorne Industries. The irony was staggering. Her father, the man who had always favored Richard, had been secretly investing in her success for 2 decades. He hadn't just accepted her path, he had financially fueled it. But the current problem was immediate and severe. Mr. Peterson, if those shares are distributed equally, that means Richard and Jennifer are each about to receive 5% of Ethelred Capital, Sarah stated, the professional dread setting in. That is a massive valuation. And it means they will be minority stakeholders in the holding company that owns Hawthorne Industries. Precisely, Ms. Hawthorne. The distribution is scheduled for the end of the month. You need to act now if you wish to prevent your siblings from becoming your unintentional business partners. The laughter of her siblings echoed in her memory one last time, but this time, it was Sarah who felt the sting of a surprise attack. She had won the war for the family legacy, only to discover her father had planted a final, explosive financial bomb right in the middle of her own empire. She had stripped them of the old company, but now, George Hawthorne's final, silent act of support meant they were about to get a piece of the new one. Sarah gripped the phone, her mind already racing through legal strategies. She had conquered Hawthorne Industries, but now, she had to conquer her own family, again, to maintain control of the company she had built from scratch. This time, the stakes were even higher. This time, the battle was personal, and it was taking place on her home turf. The game was not over. It had just entered the final, most dangerous round. She had conquered Hawthorne Industries, but now, she had to conquer her own family, again, to maintain control of the company she had built from scratch. This time, the stakes were even higher. This time, the battle was personal, and it was taking place on her home turf. The game was not over. It had just entered the final, most dangerous round. Sarah didn't waste a second. She ended the call with Mr. Peterson and immediately summoned Marcus Chen to her office. Marcus arrived looking concerned, having dealt with the fallout of the first acquisition for 2 years. 15% of Ethelred Capital. Marcus repeated, leaning back in his chair, running a hand through his already messy hair. George Hawthorne was a genius. He used blind trusts to funnel money into us for 2 decades and we never knew. That's incredible. It's incredible, and it's a catastrophe if Richard gets 5%, Sarah countered, pacing the length of her office. He won't care about the return. He'll care about the chaos. He'll demand board seats. He'll leak information. He'll try to undermine every decision we make regarding Hawthorne Industries. We cannot allow him to be a passive partner in this firm. Agreed, Marcus said, pulling up the Ethelred operating agreement on his tablet. But George structured this perfectly. It's a clean distribution of shares from a third-party trust. It's legal. I know it's legal, Marcus, but what about our internal governance documents? What does the Ethelred operating agreement say about inherited shares? Specifically, shares transferred to non-active partners. Sarah pressed. Marcus scrolled rapidly, his eyes scanning the dense legal text. A slow, thin smile spread across his face, the kind of smile that meant Sarah's foresight had once again saved them. Ah. Section 4.01, subsection C, Marcus announced, tapping the screen. The succession and redemption clause. We drafted this 6 years ago when we brought in the sovereign wealth funds. It's standard private equity language, but we made it airtight. Sarah stopped pacing. Read it. It states that any non-active, inherited equity stake, exceeding 1% of the total capital, must be redeemed by the firm within 30 days of transfer, at fair market value, to prevent disruption of the investment strategy or conflicts of interest with active partners. It's a mandatory buyout clause, Sarah. We included it specifically to prevent passive investors from gumming up the works if they died and left shares to their disinterested relatives. Sarah felt a wave of relief so intense it almost made her dizzy. She had built her company with defenses against exactly this kind of passive entitlement. She had protected her empire from the very beginning, even from the well-meaning intentions of her own father. Marcus, that is beautiful, Sarah breathed. So, Richard and Jennifer are about to receive their 5% stakes, and we are immediately going to notify them that we are legally required to buy those shares back. At fair market value, Sarah. Ethelred Capital is currently valued in the multibillions. This is going to be a massive payout for them. Far, far greater than anything they inherited in the estate reading. Sarah nodded, a cold realization settling in. Her father had intended this money to be a gift of true, undeniable security for all his children. And in a strange, final twist, it was Sarah's success, the success they had mocked, that was providing the ultimate, massive, liquid inheritance. Prepare the redemption notices, Marcus, and have the valuation team work around the clock. I want the final offer documents on their desks by the end of the week. And Marcus, schedule one last meeting. This time, I want them to come to Ethelred Capital headquarters in San Francisco. No more meetings in stuffy New York law offices. They need to see where the real power is now located. Richard and Jennifer arrived in San Francisco 3 days later. They were flying high on anticipation. The news of the Ethelred shares had leaked through Mr. Peterson's office, and they had spent the flight calculating the astronomical value of 5% of Sarah's highly secretive, hyper-successful VC firm. This was it. They had lost the old company, yes, but George's final act had secured them a permanent, massive stream of wealth from Sarah's venture. They were about to be partners, silent, passive, but incredibly rich partners, in the machine that had crushed Richard. They were ushered into the gleaming, minimalist lobby of Ethelred Capital, a space that felt like the future compared to the dark wood and leather of Hawthorne Industries. Sarah met them in the main conference room, the vast window overlooking the entire Bay Area. She looked like the CEO of a multi-billion-dollar enterprise, composed, formidable, and entirely in control. Richard, having regained his swagger, immediately extended his hand. Sarah. So, the old man came through, eh? 5% of Ethelred. You know, I always said you had a good head for numbers. We are partners now. I'm thinking we should discuss the Hawthorne Industries portfolio strategy. Sarah ignored his outstretched hand and gestured to the seats. Sit down, Richard. Jennifer. We have a brief, mandatory meeting. The temperature in the room dropped instantly. Mandatory? Jennifer asked, clutching her designer handbag. Yes. This meeting is to discuss the immediate redemption of the shares you are about to receive from the George Hawthorne Trust, Sarah stated, her voice as smooth and cool as the glass table between them. Richard's smile vanished. Redemption? What are you talking about? We are inheriting these shares. They are ours. You can't just take them. Sarah opened a folder and slid 2 stacks of documents toward them, one for Richard, one for Jennifer. I am not taking them, Richard. Ethelred Capital is required to purchase them from you, Sarah explained, watching their faces intently. Section 4.01, subsection C of the Ethelred Operating Agreement mandates that any inherited, non-active equity stake exceeding 1% must be redeemed at fair market value within 30 days of transfer. This is to protect the integrity of our investment strategy and prevent conflicts of interest. Richard snatched up the document, his eyes scanning the dense legal print. He looked furious, betrayed. This is outrageous. You drafted this clause to exclude us. This is just another way to cut us out. I drafted that clause 6 years ago, Richard, to protect the firm from any potential disruption caused by passive, non-contributing shareholders. It was a standard protective measure. I had no idea my father was secretly investing in Ethelred at the time, Sarah replied, her tone unwavering. You have no right to be a partner here. You have no understanding of venture capital, and your involvement would be actively detrimental to the firm's success. Jennifer, however, was flipping past the legal jargon to the financial summary. Her eyes widened, not with anger, but with shock. Richard, look at this, Jennifer whispered, pointing to the valuation. Richard grudgingly looked at the numbers. Sarah had been ruthlessly efficient. Because Ethelred Capital was private and highly successful, the valuation was astronomical. The check Sarah was offering for their 5% stake was enormous, enough to buy and sell the entirety of the old Hawthorne Industries property they had fought over. The valuation was completed by 3 independent firms and approved by our institutional investors, Sarah stated, anticipating his complaint. This is the undisputed fair market value for your 5% stake. It is a one-time, lump sum payment. You will receive the money in liquid assets within 10 business days of the trust completing the transfer. Richard stared at the figure, his jaw slack. This wasn't the small, residual dividend stream they had been fighting over for years. This was life-changing, generational wealth, pure, liquid cash, delivered with no strings attached. This is more than Dad left us in the entire trust reading combined, Richard stammered, the fight draining out of him. Significantly more, Sarah confirmed. Your father wanted to ensure you were financially secure, Richard. This money ensures you never have to worry about working again, let alone paying for the maintenance on the Greenwich estate, if you hadn't already sold it. The irony was the final, perfect punchline. They had mocked Sarah for her fake money, but her fake money was the only thing that was truly saving their financial futures. Richard looked from the document to Sarah, a mixture of rage, awe, and complete defeat in his eyes. He realized the terrifying extent of Sarah's genius. She didn't just play the game, she wrote the rules, and she built the stadium. You win, Sarah, Richard finally spat out, his voice hollow. You always win. No, Richard, Sarah corrected him gently. I prepared. You coasted. That is the difference. You and Jennifer will receive the full financial benefit of my hard work and my father's quiet support, but you will never again be in a position to interfere with my business or my life. Jennifer, who had been quietly calculating the interest on the lump sum, looked up at Sarah, tears welling in her eyes, but these were tears of gratitude, not bitterness. Sarah, thank you, Jennifer said honestly. This money changes everything for me. It means I can focus on my design business without the pressure of Michael's issues. It means security. Thank you for building something real. Sarah nodded, accepting the thanks without undue emotion. Jennifer was truly trying to change, and the money would secure that path. Richard, defeated, snatched a pen and scrawled his signature on the redemption agreement. He didn't look up again. Mr. Peterson will handle the final legal details, Sarah concluded, standing up. The firm will transfer the funds immediately upon receiving the trust distribution. This concludes our business relationship, Richard and Jennifer. She didn't offer a farewell or a handshake. She simply walked out of the conference room, leaving them alone with their documents and their staggering, unexpected wealth. Sarah watched the 2 cars carrying Richard and Jennifer pull away from the Ethelred Capitol building, heading toward the airport. Marcus came up beside her, holding 2 signed copies of the redemption agreements. The final chapter, Marcus said, a sense of immense relief in his voice. They are out. Permanently. And they are set for life, thanks to you. Sarah took a deep breath, the cold air of the Bay Area invigorating. And thanks to Dad, Sarah murmured. She finally understood George Hawthorne. He hadn't been choosing Richard over her all those years. He was protecting his legacy by hedging his bets. He had publicly supported the traditional path, Richard, while secretly funding the disruptive path, Sarah. He knew Richard would inherit the old company, but he wanted Sarah to have the capital to build the new one. And when the old company failed, he ensured that Sarah, the competent one, would have the legal mechanism, the codicil, to clean up the mess, and that all his children would be paid handsomely by her success, the Ethelred shares. It was the ultimate, brilliant, silent trust structure. George Hawthorne hadn't been sentimental. He had been the true financial genius of the family. He was playing the long game, Marcus, Sarah said, a genuine smile touching her lips. He knew I would succeed, and he built a safety net into my company to ensure that success was protected from family interference, even after he was gone. He didn't just invest in Ethelred, he invested in *Me Star. Sarah's revenge had not been the acquisition was professional necessity. Her true, final victory was realizing that the man who seemed to dismiss her the most was the one who had quietly laid the groundwork for her ultimate, undeniable triumph. She was the majority owner, the undisputed leader, and the financial genius they had always scoffed at. The story of Sarah Hawthorne, the black sheep, was finally complete. She had the company, the wealth, and the respect. But more importantly, she had the freedom that came from knowing she had built her own empire, and no one, not even the ghost of her father's legacy, could ever take it away. She was finally free to simply run her company, without the constant need to prove her worth to anyone. The game was over, and Sarah had won on every single board.